Before there were airplanes, before steamships, before even proper maps of the world, there was a moment when humanity took its first true step toward becoming connected. Picture a cold morning on the edge of ancient China. The sun is just rising. A merchant tightens the ropes on his camel's load. Wrapped carefully in cloth is something light, smooth, and unbelievably precious. It is silk, not gold, not jewel silt, worth more than its weight in silver in lands he has never seen and will probably never return from. He does not know the full length of the journey ahead. No one does. He only knows the next town, the next market, the next stretch of desert or mountain. Yet with every step forward, he becomes part of something larger than himself, a chain of paths that will one day bind continents together. This is where the story of the Silk Road truly begins. When we hear the name Silk Road, it sounds simple, almost neat, like a single highway cutting across Asia. But that image is misleading. There was no one road, no official starting gate, no clear end. The Silk Road was a living network, a web of land routes and sea lanes, constantly shifting, growing, shrinking, and changing with time. It stretched thousands of miles. From the ancient cities of China, through deserts and mountains, across Central Asia, into Persia, the Middle East, and finally Europe. Later, it extended across oceans, linking ports in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and beyond. It was not built by one empire or planned by one ruler. It emerged slowly, step by step, as people followed opportunity. The Silk Road was not created in a single year. It evolved by historians usually trace its beginnings to around the 2nd century BCE, during the Han Dynasty of China. At that time, China was powerful, wealthy, and curious about the lands beyond its borders. To the west lay unknown kingdoms, fierce nomadic tribes, and rumors of civilizations that prized Chinese goods. One of those goods changed everything. Silk was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. It was light, strong, smooth, and luminous. Two people in Rome, Persia, and India. Silk seemed almost magical. Some believed it was made from plant fibers. Others thought it came from tree bark or sea creatures. The secret of silk production, using silkworms and mulberry leaves, was guarded closely by the Chinese for centuries. This mystery made silk more than just fabric. It became a symbol of power, status, and wealth. Roman senators complained that silk drained gold from the empire, yet Roman elites could not stop wearing it. Persian kings demanded it. Indian traders sought it. Silk became the most famous item moving across these routes, so famous that later historians named the entire network after it. But focusing only on silk misses the real story. Because the Silk Road was never just about trade, it was about contact. As caravans moved east and west, they carried far more than goods. They carried languages, religions, inventions, diseases, and ideas. A merchant might start his journey in China and travel only a few hundred miles. Another merchant would take the goods farther west. Then another. Goods changed hands many times, passing through dozens of cultures before reaching their final destination. People did not need to travel the whole distance for the network to work. The Silk Road functioned like a relay. Each city, oasis, and port became a link in the chain. These cities were not empty rest stops. They were vibrant crossroads. Places like Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, and Merv became centers of culture and commerce. Here, Chinese traders met Persian merchants. Indian monks debated with Greek philosophers. Nomads exchanged horses for grain. Every meeting left a trace. To understand the Silk Road, you have to imagine movement. Endless movement. Caravans, crossing the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Paths threading through the towering Pamir Mountains, known as the roof of the world. Ships riding the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean, guided by stars and seasonal patterns. These routes were shaped by geography, climate, and survival. Nothing about the Silk Road was easy. Bandits lurked along isolated stretches. Sandstorms could erase entire caravans. Snow closed mountain passes for months. Yet people kept traveling. Why? Because the rewards were enormous. A successful journey could bring fortune. A failed one could mean death. And still, they went. This constant movement slowly connected worlds that had once been isolated. For the first time in history, East and West were not distant ideas. They were neighbors in a shared system. China learned of powerful horses from Central Asia and sought them desperately for its armies. India shared spices, mathematics, and religious ideas. Persia became a middle ground, blending influences from every direction. The Mediterranean world received goods and stories from lands it could barely imagine. Even knowledge itself became a traveler. Paper, invented in China, slowly moved west. Gunpowder followed centuries later. Glass-making techniques moved east. Medical knowledge, astronomy, and geography spread along the same routes as silk and spices. Religions traveled. Buddhism moved from India into Central Asia and China. Later, Christianity and Islam followed similar paths. None of this was planned. The Silk Road was not a project. It was a process. Over time, these connections changed how people saw the world. Maps expanded. Curiosity grew. The idea that different cultures could exchange not just goods but ideas began to take hold. This was globalization before the word existed. Yet it is important to understand that the Silk Road was never peaceful all the time. Empires rose and fell along its paths. Wars disrupted trade. Borders closed and reopened. When strong empires controlled large regions, trade flourished. When chaos ruled, routes shifted or vanished. That is why the Silk Road never stayed the same. Some paths faded as others emerged. Land routes declined when sea routes grew stronger. New powers redirected trade. But the core idea remained. Connection, exchange, movement. The term Silk Road itself is actually modern. It was coined in the 19th century by a German scholar, long after the routes had lost their ancient importance. The people who lived and traveled these paths never called it that. To them, it was simply the world as they knew it. A series of journeys, markets, dangers, and opportunities. Understanding this changes how we see history. History is often taught as separate stories. Chinese history, Roman history, Indian history, Islamic history. The Silk Road reminds us that these stories were never truly separate. They were intertwined. What happened in one region affected another, sometimes thousands of miles away. A decision in a Chinese court could influence fashion in Rome. A religious idea born in India could shape Chinese philosophy. A new technology developed in the Middle East could alter warfare in Europe. The Silk Road made the ancient world smaller. It turned distance into connection. So when we ask, what was the Silk Road? The answer is not just a network of trade routes. It was humanity's first great experiment in long-distance connection. It was proof that cultures do not grow in isolation. They grow through contact, exchange, and sometimes conflict. It was the meeting place of East and West, not in one city or one moment, but across centuries of movement. And this is only the beginning. Because once these routes opened, they reshaped the world in ways their first travelers could never have imagined. Imagine a quiet village in ancient China, long before the world knew its name. At dawn, mist hangs over mulberry trees. Inside a modest home, a woman carefully lifts a small white cocoon from a woven basket. It looks simple, fragile, almost worthless. Yet this tiny cocoon holds a secret that will shape global history. This is where the silk trade is born. Long before foreign merchants dreamed of Chinese luxury, silk was already woven into the fabric of Chinese life. According to legend, the discovery of silk dates back thousands of years. To the time of Empress Li Zhu, the story says a silkworm cocoon fell into her tea, unraveled in the hot water, and revealed a thread so fine and strong that it could be woven into cloth. Whether myth or memory, the truth is clear. China mastered silk production earlier than any other civilization. By the time of the Han Dynasty, starting in the 2nd century BCE, silk was no longer just a luxury. It was an industry, a state asset, and a symbol of power. Making silk was slow, delicate work. Silkworms were raised on fresh mulberry leaves. Their lives were carefully controlled. When the worms spun their cocoons, the cocoons were boiled to loosen the threads. Each cocoon produced a single thread, sometimes thousands of feet long. These threads were then spun together and woven into fabric so smooth it seemed unreal to those who had never touched it. The process required skill, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations. A single mistake could ruin the silk. That knowledge was more valuable than the silk itself. China understood this. The Han government treated silk like a strategic resource. Silk was used as currency. Officials were paid in bolts of silk. Soldiers received silk as rewards. Diplomats carried silk as gifts to foreign rulers. It was not just clothing, it was diplomacy in fabric form. As the Han Empire expanded westward, it came into contact with nomadic tribes and distant kingdoms. These groups wanted Chinese silk, and they were willing to offer horses, jades, gold, and protection in return. Especially horses. Strong, Central Asian horses were vital for the Han army, and silk became the key to obtaining them. Trade was not left entirely to chance. The Chinese state actively supported and controlled long-distance trade. Roads were improved, military garrisons were placed along key routes. Officials monitored who could trade and where. Early Chinese merchants did not wander freely across continents. Many operated under state protection, moving from one controlled region to the next. At the same time, China guarded the secret of silk with extreme care. Exporting silkworms or revealing the production process was forbidden. Smuggling silkworm eggs could mean death. For centuries, the outside world knew silk only as a finished product. How it was made remained a mystery. This secrecy increased silk's value even more. To foreign buyers, silk was not just rare, it was unknowable, a material that came from a distant land at the edge of the world. Roman writers described it with wonder and suspicion. Some believed silk weakened morality. Others believed it was worth any price. Inside China, silk also shaped society. Who could wear it, and in what colors, was strictly regulated. Silk became a marker of rank and authority. The emperor and his court used it to display power. Ordinary people could produce silk, but wearing certain types was restricted. Behind the scenes, merchants quietly built networks. They traveled to frontier markets, negotiated with middlemen, and learned which goods foreign traders desired. They rarely saw the end of the Silk Road. Most journeys were short. But together, these short journeys formed a vast chain of exchange stretching far beyond China's borders. The Han Dynasty did something remarkable. It turned a local craft into a global commodity. Without intending to, it set in motion a system that connected China to lands it had never conquered and peoples it would never rule. Silk left China as fabric, but it returned as influence. Through silk, China entered the imagination of the ancient world. It became a land of wealth, skill, and mystery. A place people spoke of, even if they had never seen it. This chapter of the Silk Road is not about caravans crossing deserts yet. It is about a secret, protected and perfected, and a civilization confident enough to trade it on its own terms. And once silk began to move, it could never be contained. Before the Silk Road ever stretched beyond China's borders. Before foreign merchants learned the name of the Han Empress, the story of silk was already deeply rooted in everyday Chinese life. To understand how the Silk Road truly began, we must slow down and look closely at ancient China itself. Not the caravans yet, not the deserts, but the farms, workshops, courts, and quiet households where silk was first born. Imagine inland China during the Han Dynasty. Villages sit beside rivers. Fields of millet and wheat sway in the wind. But just beyond the farms stand mulberry groves, carefully tended and protected. These trees are not grown for fruit. They exist for one reason only, to feed silkworms. Inside homes, silk production is not loud or dramatic. It is patient work. Women and children raise silkworms from tiny eggs, no larger than grains of sand. The worms eat constantly, day and night. Their lives are watched closely. Temperature, humidity, cleanliness, everything matters. If the worms fall sick, the silk is lost. When the time comes, the worms spin cocoons around themselves. Soft white shells that look fragile but contain something extraordinary. Inside each cocoon is a single silk filament, sometimes stretching hundreds or even thousands of meters long. That thread is finer than hair, yet stronger than many natural fibers. This is where the magic happens. The cocoons are placed in hot water. Not boiling wildly, but carefully heated. The heat loosens the natural glue holding the fibers together. Skilled hands then find the loose end of the filament and begin to unwind it slowly. One cocoon becomes one continuous thread. Several threads are twisted together to form silk yarn. That yarn is woven on looms into cloth that shines in the light. This process takes time. It takes skill. It takes knowledge passed down over generations. Silk is not accidental. It is the result of control over nature. That control is what made silk so valuable. Silk was light but strong, smooth but durable. It could be dyed bright colors that did not fade easily. In hot weather, it felt cool. In cold weather, it retained warmth. No other fabric in the ancient world could compare. Inside China, silk quickly became more than clothing. It became a measure of wealth and status. Government officials were paid in silk. Taxes were collected in silk. Records were written on silk before paper became common. Silk banners, silk robes, silk gifts. It was everywhere among the elite. The Han state understood something critical very early. Silk was power. During the Han Dynasty, which began in 26 BCE, China expanded its borders and strengthened central control. The emperors needed loyalty from officials, generals, and frontier allies. Silk became a tool of governance. Reward loyal service with silk. Impress foreign envoys with silk. Buy peace with silk. In some regions, silk functioned like money. This made the silk industry a matter of national importance. The state monitored production. Certain workshops were under imperial control. The finest silk was reserved for the court. Colors and patterns were regulated by law. Wearing the wrong type of silk could be a crime. Yet silk production itself remained widespread. Ordinary families raised silkworms and produced silk, especially women. It was labor-intensive, but it brought income and stability. The state benefited from this decentralized production while controlling distribution at higher levels. Now imagine a foreign visitor arriving at the Han court. He sees silk everywhere. Flowing robes, painted hangings, smooth banners catching the light. He touches a fabric and realizes it is unlike anything he has ever known. He wants it. His ruler wants it. His people will pay almost any price for it. But when he asks how it is made, the answers are vague, or false, or politely avoided, because China protected the secret of silk fiercely. For centuries, revealing the method of silk production was forbidden. Smuggling silkworm eggs, cocoons, or mulberry seeds out of China was a capital crime. Guards watched borders. Officials monitored traders. Knowledge itself was treated as a treasure. This secrecy was intentional. If others learned how to make silk, China would lose its advantage. As long as silk could only be produced in China, foreign dependence remained. Trade flowed toward China. Wealth flowed inward. Influence expanded outward. And for a very long time, it worked. Outside China, silk was so mysterious that people invented explanations. Some believed silk grew on trees. Others thought it was combed from plants or gathered from insects living in forests. Roman writers debated its origins with no clear answers. This mystery increased demand. The more distant and unknown the source, the more valuable the product became. As the Han Dynasty expanded westward, silk began moving beyond China's internal markets. This did not happen suddenly. It was cautious, strategic. The Han court faced constant threats from nomadic tribes along its northern and western borders, especially the Xiongnu. These groups were powerful horsemen. They raided Chinese territory and disrupted trade. To counter them, the Han needed allies, information, and especially horses. Silk became the bargaining chip. The Han sent silk westward in exchange for horses, alliances, and safe passage. Envoys were dispatched to explore lands beyond China. The most famous was Chang'an, sent in the 2nd century BCE. His journey revealed a network of kingdoms in Central Asia that were eager for Chinese goods. This discovery changed everything. For the first time, China understood that it was not alone. There were civilizations to the west that could trade, cooperate, and compete. Silk was the key that opened those doors. But again, trade was not free or uncontrolled. Early Chinese merchants did not operate like modern traders. They often worked within state systems. The government regulated who could trade, where, and with what goods. Military protection accompanied caravans in dangerous regions. Forts and garrisons were established along frontier routes. Trade and politics were inseparable. Merchants carried silk, but they also carried messages. Information about foreign lands flowed back to the court. Reports of customs, rulers, resources, and threats. In this way, trade became intelligence. Most Chinese merchants did not travel all the way to the Mediterranean. That idea is a modern misunderstanding. Instead, they traded with nearby regions. Goods passed through many hands. Silk left China and moved west in stages, changing owners many times. A bolt of silk might begin in a Chinese village, then reach a frontier market, then pass to Central Asian traders, then Persian merchants, then finally Roman buyers. Each exchange increased its value. By the time silk reached Rome, it was unimaginably expensive. Roman elites loved it and feared it. Some Roman writers accused silk of corrupting morals. Others warned that Roman gold was flowing east, never to return. Yet demand never stopped. Back in China, the state watched this process carefully. The Han rulers wanted the benefits of trade without losing control. They encouraged silk exports but limited the spread of production knowledge. They balanced openness with protectionism. This balance allowed China to dominate silk trade for centuries. It is important to understand that China did not set out to create a global trade network. There was no master plan called the Silk Road. Instead, the Silk Road emerged from choices. Decisions to protect silk. Decisions to trade silk. Decisions to explore and defend borders. Silk was the thread that pulled everything together. Through silk, China reached beyond conquest. It influenced lands it never ruled. It shaped economies it never controlled. Silk carried with it the image of China as wealthy, refined, and powerful. Inside China, silk remained tied to identity. It symbolized civilization itself. To be Chinese was to know silk. To wear it correctly, to produce it skillfully, to value its role in society. Outside China, silk symbolized the unknown East, a land of wonders beyond deserts and mountains. This gap in understanding made the Silk Road possible. One side had the secret, the other had desire. And between them stood merchants, envoys, soldiers, and storytellers. People willing to move, negotiate, and risk their lives for profit or purpose. By the end of the Han Dynasty, silk was no longer just a Chinese product. It was a global obsession. Routes were forming, markets were adjusting, empires were paying attention. The birth of the Silk Road did not happen on a road. It happened in mulberry groves, in quiet workshops, in imperial courts, and in careful laws protecting a fragile thread. Once silk left China, it could not be pulled back. And in the next chapter, we will follow that thread as it moves across deserts and mountains, carried by caravans into the heart of Central Asia, where the Silk Road truly takes shape. Before we follow merchants, monks, or empires any further, we need to stop and look at the land itself. Because the Silk Road was not drawn on maps first, it was carved by geography. If you remove the deserts, the mountains, the rivers, and the winds, the Silk Road does not exist. Imagine standing at the western edge of ancient China. In front of you lies not a clear path, but a choice. North or south. Each direction leads into landscapes so extreme that they seem designed to test human limits. There are no signs, no roads paved in stone. Only memory, rumor, and the faint tracks left by those who passed before. This is where the Silk Road truly begins. The Silk Road was never a single line. It was a system of routes shaped by the land itself. Geography decided where people could go, where they had to stop, and where they might die if they made the wrong decision. Every merchant knew that choosing a route was not just a business choice, it was a survival choice. At its heart, the Silk Road divided into three main land routes: the northern route, the central route, and the southern route. Each had its own dangers, advantages, and role in shaping trade. Let us begin with the land that forced these routes to exist. At the center of the Silk Road lay one of the most feared places on earth, the Taklamakan Desert. The name itself carries a warning. Many scholars translate it loosely as the place you go in and never come out. It is one of the largest sandy deserts in the world, endless dunes, burning heat by day, freezing cold by night. Almost no water. A single mistake here could erase an entire caravan. No one crossed the Taklamakan directly if they could avoid it. Instead, merchants traveled around its edge. This single desert split the Silk Road into northern and southern branches. Geography forced the Silk Road to bend. The northern route ran along the edge of the desert, closer to the Tian Shan Mountains. The southern route followed the Kunlun mountain range. Both routes relied on oasis cities, small pockets of life fed by melting snow from distant peaks. Without these oases, trade would have been impossible. Cities like Dunhuang, Turpan, Kucha, Hotan, and Kashgar became lifelines. They were not just rest stops, they were hubs of survival. Merchants rested, traded, repaired equipment, hired guides, exchanged animals, and gathered information. Knowledge of the next stretch of land was as valuable as silk itself. Let us walk one of these routes. Starting in China, caravans moved west from the Han capital, passing through the narrow Hexi corridor. This corridor was a thin strip of land squeezed between mountains and desert. It was the only reliable gateway out of China towards Central Asia. Control of this corridor meant control of trade. That is why the Han Dynasty invested heavily here. Forts, watchtowers, garrisons. This was not just geography, it was strategy. From the Hexi corridor, caravans reached Dunhuang, the last major Chinese city before the desert world began. Beyond this point, Chinese authority faded. Languages changed, cultures blended, danger increased. From Dunhuang, merchants had to choose. The northern route curved along the base of the Tian Shan Mountains. This path offered cooler temperatures and access to grazing lands for animals. Horses survived better here. But the route was longer and vulnerable to raids by nomadic tribes. The southern route hugged the Kunlun Mountains. It was shorter, but harsher. Water sources were fewer. Sandstorms were brutal. Caravans here relied heavily on precise knowledge of oasis locations. Neither route was safe. Both existed because the desert allowed no alternative. Eventually, these routes reunited at Kashgar, one of the most important cities on the Silk Road. Kashgar was a true crossroads. From here, paths led north into the steppes, west into Persia, and south toward India. It was a melting pot of languages, religions, and goods. Now, the terrain changes again. West of Kashgar rise the Pamir Mountains, often called the roof of the world. These mountains are vast, high, and unforgiving. Thin air, narrow passes, sudden snowstorms, even in summer. Crossing the Pamirs was one of the most dangerous stages of the journey, yet merchants crossed them anyway. Why? Because beyond the Pamirs lay rich lands, fertile valleys, powerful kingdoms, profitable markets. Geography created obstacles, but it also concentrated trade. Anyone who made it through the mountains reached regions where demand was high and competition was limited. Danger increased value. A bolt of silk that survived deserts and mountains was worth far more than one that stayed near its place of origin. Every mile of hardship added price. Beyond the Pyramids, the Silk Road entered Central Asia. Here, geography softened slightly. Grasslands, rivers, and valleys supported cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. These cities became giants of trade and culture. They thrived not because they produced silk, but because geography placed them perfectly between worlds. Central Asia was the middle of everything. Goods from China met goods from India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Ideas collided. Religions spread. Art styles merged. Geography turned these cities into permanent meeting points. Now let us step back and look at the bigger picture. The Silk Road was not only land routes. Sea routes mattered just as much. While caravans struggled across deserts and mountains, ships moved across the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Persian Gulf. These maritime routes are often called the Maritime Silk Road. Geography again dictated movement. Monsoon winds made long-distance sea travel possible. Sailors learned to ride seasonal winds, traveling west in one season and east in another. Ports like Guangzhou, Calicut, and Aden became key trade hubs. Sea routes were faster and cheaper for bulk goods. But they carried their own dangers: storms, pirates, shipwrecks. Therefore, many traders, the sea was preferable to deserts. Over time, land and sea routes worked together. When land routes were blocked by war or weather, sea routes expanded. When sea routes were unsafe, caravans returned to land. Geography kept the Silk Road flexible. Now consider why geography made trade profitable. The difficulty of the journey limited who could participate. Not everyone could afford camels, guards, guides, and supplies. Not everyone had the knowledge to navigate deserts or mountains. This scarcity reduced competition. Fewer traders meant higher prices. Goods that survived the journey arrived rare and expensive. Silk, spices, gemstones, incense, glassware, paper. Their value multiplied with distance. Geography also shaped what was traded. Heavy, low-value goods rarely traveled far. High-value low-weight goods dominated. Silk was perfect. So were spices and precious metals. Geography filtered trade naturally. At the same time, geography encouraged specialization. Regions produced what their land allowed. China produced silk. India produced spices. Central Asia supplied horses. Persia refined metals and crafts. The Mediterranean offered glass and wine. The Silk Road connected these specializations, but geography also meant constant risk. Caravans faced bandits who knew the land better than any outsider. Passes could be blocked by snow. Rivers could flood. Deserts could shift. A route used one year might vanish the next. This uncertainty created an entire profession. Guides. Local guides were essential. They knew where water could be found, which tribes were friendly, which routes were currently safe. Hiring the wrong guide could be fatal. Knowledge was survival. This is why Silk Road cities became centers of information. News traveled as fast as goods. Merchants shared stories of blocked passes, hostile rulers, or new markets. Geography made information as valuable as cargo. Empires understood this too. Control key passes, and you control trade. That is why so many empires fought over Silk Road regions. Geography turned land into power. The Han Dynasty protected the Hexi corridor. Persian empires guarded mountain passes. Later, Islamic caliphates secured Central Asian routes. Whoever controlled geography controlled wealth. Yet no empire ever controlled the entire Silk Road for long. The land was too vast, too harsh, too fragmented, and that is the final lesson of Silk Road geography. The Silk Road survived not because it was easy, but because it adapted. When one route became dangerous, another opened. When deserts shifted, paths moved. When empires fell, merchants found new ways. The Silk Road was shaped by deserts that could kill you, mountains that could break you, and distances that tested human endurance. And yet, people crossed them. They crossed because geography did something strange. It made connection difficult, but not impossible. And in that narrow space between danger and opportunity, the Silk Road was born. In the next chapter, we will meet the people who mastered this geography. The caravans, the camel drivers, the traders, and the travelers who turned hostile land into the world's greatest network of exchange. Before the Silk Road was known for silk, spices, or impious, it was known for people on the move. Not armies marching in formation, not explorers chasing glory, but ordinary men and women walking beside camels, counting steps, counting days, and hoping the next city would appear before their water ran out. To understand the Silk Road, you must step inside its cities and travel with its caravans. Because this network did not survive on maps. It survived through human routines, shared spaces, and the fragile rhythm of daily life on the road. Let us begin where many journeys began. In ancient China, Chang'an was more than a capital. It was the heartbeat of the Eastern Silk Road, one of the largest cities on earth at the time. Wide avenues, guarded gates, markets filled with noise, color, and smell. Silk workshops hummed quietly behind walls, while foreign merchants gathered in designated districts, speaking languages few locals understood. Here, traders prepared for journeys that could last months or years. Contracts were made, goods were inspected, camels were bought or rented. Caravans were organized, not by destination, but by direction. Westward Chang'an was where silk became cargo. Leaving the city gates was not dramatic. No ceremonies, just movement. One step beyond the walls, and the empire slowly loosened its grip. Each mile west meant less protection, fewer familiar customs, and more reliance on strangers. Weeks later, after deserts and oases, caravans reached Kashgar. Kashgar was not impressive because of grand buildings. It mattered because of location. It sat at the crossroads of everything. North, south, east, west. Routes from China, India, Persia, and the steppes met here. In Kashgar, caravans often stopped for long periods. Goods were repacked. Some traders turned back. Others joined new groups heading in different directions. Languages blended. You could hear Chinese, Persian, Turkic, Indian tongues all in one market. This was where many traders realized the truth of the Silk Road. Very few people traveled the whole distance. A Chinese merchant might sell silk in Kashgar and return home with horses or jade. A Central Asian trader would carry that silk westward. A Persian merchant might take it farther still. The Silk Road worked because cities like Kashgar acted as relay stations. From Kashgar, caravans pushed west into Central Asia, toward cities that became legends. Samarkand was wealth made visible. Blue tiles, gardens, flowing water channels, markets stacked with goods from every direction. It thrived not because it produced silk, but because it sat perfectly between worlds. Here, silk met spicy Chinese paper, met Persian ink. Indian mathematics met Greek philosophy. Samarkand was a place where ideas were traded as eagerly as goods. Merchants rested here longer. Repairs were made. Animals were replaced. Information was exchanged. Which passes were safe. Which rulers were friendly. Which cities were worth visiting. Nearby stood Bukhara, another jewel of Central Asia. Smaller than Samarkand, but just as important. Bukhara became famous for scholarship, religion, and trade. Caravan leaders preferred it because it was well organized and secure. These cities understood merchants. They built infrastructure for them. This brings us to one of the most important but often overlooked features of Silk Road life. Caravanserais. A caravanserai was not just an inn. It was survival architecture. These roadside complexes appeared every day's journey or so, roughly 30 to 40 kilometers apart. Thick walls. A single guarded gate. A central courtyard where camels could rest. Rooms for traders. Storage spaces for goods. Wells for water. At night, the gates were locked. Inside, merchants from different lands slept under the same roof. Fires burned, meals were shared, stories were exchanged. Deals were made quietly in corners. Trust formed not through contracts, but through repetition and reputation. Caravanserais made long-distance trade possible. Without them, journeys would have been far deadlier. But even with them, life on the road was brutal. Camels were the backbone of the Silk Road, especially the Bactrian camel, with 2 humps. These animals could survive days without water, carry heavy loads, and endure extreme temperatures. Traders depended on them completely. A typical caravan moved slowly, 15 to 20 miles a day on good terrain, less in deserts or mountains. Everyone walked, even wealthy merchants. Riding was rare and saved for emergencies. Days began before sunrise. Animals were loaded. Packs were checked and rechecked. A single broken strap could cost everything. During the march, silence was common. Talking wasted energy. Focus mattered. Food was simple: flatbread, dried meat, rice when available. Tea. Water was rationed carefully. No one drank freely unless water was abundant. At night, camps were set carefully. Fires were small to avoid attracting attention. Guards were posted. Bandits were a constant threat, especially near passes and oases. This was not romantic travel. It was As caravans moved west, they reached Merv, another critical city. Merv sat near fertile land and river systems. It became a staging ground between Central Asia and Persia. Merchants reorganized here, preparing for new political realities and cultural rules. Beyond Merv, routes led toward the heart of the Islamic world. Eventually, goods reached Baghdad. Baghdad was different from earlier cities. It was not ancient when it rose to prominence. It was planned, built deliberately as a center of power, learning, and trade. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad became one of the most important cities on earth. Here, Silk Road goods entered vast markets. Silk, spices, paper, precious stones. Everything flowed into Baghdad and outward again. Scholars gathered knowledge from east and west. Translations flourished. Science, medicine, and philosophy thrived. For many goods, Baghdad was the end of the line. From here, they moved into the Mediterranean world. For traders, reaching Baghdad meant success. But survival was never guaranteed. Disease traveled with caravans. Injuries healed slowly. Loneliness weighed heavily. Many traders never returned home. Some settled permanently in foreign cities, marrying locally and becoming part of new cultures. Children grew up speaking multiple languages, eating mixed cuisines, practicing blended traditions. The Silk Road created communities that did not fit neatly into one identity. This was its quiet power. Trade cities were not just markets. They were cultural engines. In Chang'an, foreign music entered Chinese courts. In Samarkand, Chinese art influenced local design. In Baghdad, knowledge from India and China reshaped science. Caravan life forced cooperation. No one survived alone. Trust was essential. A single dishonest act could destroy reputation and end a trading career. This created an unwritten code. Share water, respect contracts, protect guests, honor agreements. These rules were not laws passed by kings. They were laws enforced by distance and memory. Break them, and no one would trade with you again. That is how order emerged without empires controlling everything. The Silk Road was held together by cities that welcomed strangers and caravans that trusted routine over comfort. It was slow, dangerous, uncertain. Yet for centuries, people chose this life because the reward was not just profit. It was connection. Every major city along the Silk Road was a door between worlds. Every caravan was a moving bridge. Every journey stitched humanity a little closer together. In the next chapter, we will see what else traveled these routes, besides goods, ideas, religions, technologies, forces that changed civilizations forever. Before we move on to empires, religions, or inventions, we need to stay a little longer with the people who made the Silk Road function every single day. Not rulers, not generals, but traders, guides, guards, animal handlers, cooks, translators, and families who lived between cities, between cultures, and often between life and death. This is the Silk Road at ground level. This is Chapter 4, Part 2. Life inside the great trade cities and life on the road between them. Let us return again to Chang'an, but this time not as a capital, rather as a departure point for human lives. For many traders, Chang'an was home. For others, it was the farthest east they would ever go. Foreign merchants lived in special quarters, watched by officials, but also protected. They brought goods from lands Chinese citizens had never seen. Roman glass, Persian silverware, Central Asian horses, Indian spices. In the markets, deals were slow and careful. Trust mattered more than speed. Goods were tested. Silk was examined against the light. Weights were checked again and again. Contracts were spoken aloud, often in front of witnesses, because written agreements across cultures were risky. When a caravan prepared to leave Chang'an, it did not feel heroic. It felt heavy. Families said goodbye, knowing they might never see each other again. Traders carried small personal items, charms, religious texts, tokens from home. These objects mattered more than profit. When the road grew long, from Chang'an, the city walls faded, and the road narrowed. Life shifted from urban rhythm to survival rhythm. Weeks later, after the Hexi Corridor and Desert Edge's caravans reached Dunhuang here, traders rested longer. Dunhuang was famous for its caves filled with art and manuscripts. Many travelers prayed here before entering harsher lands. Religion and trade mixed naturally. Protection was requested from every god known. Beyond Dunhuang came the choice to define many journeys, north or south of the Taklamakan, whichever route was chosen. The next major anchor was Kashgar. Kashgar was not just a city, it was a decision point. Many traders never went past it. In Kashgar, goods were redistributed. Silk bundles were divided. Some were sold locally. Others were transferred to new caravans. Prices changed here dramatically. What was expensive in China could be cheap in Central Asia, and vice versa. Daily life in Kashgar was loud and crowded. Markets ran from dawn to dusk. Animals, humans, and carts filled the streets. Smells of cooked meat, spices, animal sweat, and dust mixed in the air. Money changers sat behind small tables, converting currencies from dozens of regions. Language barriers were solved creatively. Gestures, interpreters, repetition, trust built slowly. Kashgar also exposed traders to cultural blending. Clothing styles mixed Chinese cuts with Central Asian fabrics. Food combined ingredients from multiple regions. Children grew up speaking several languages without thinking about it. From Kashgar caravans it continued west, entered lands dominated by movement. Here, we meet the true masters of the road, the caravan leaders. These were experienced men, sometimes women, who knew routes, seasons, and politics. They decided when to move, when to wait, and when to turn back. Their authority was rarely questioned. One wrong decision could cost lives. Camels were loaded at dawn. Each animal carried carefully balanced packs. Too heavy, and the camel would collapse. Too light, and the caravan lost profit. Every item was counted. The caravan moved as a single unit. No one walked ahead. No one lagged behind. At night, camps were formed in circles. Animals inside, humans outside. Guards stayed awake in shifts. This rhythm repeated for weeks. Then the caravan reached Samarkand. Samarkand was a reward. After barren landscapes, it felt almost unreal. Gardens, flowing water, brick buildings, decorated with color, markets full of noise and abundance. Here, traders allowed themselves rest. Real rest. Samarkand was also where traders became something more than carriers of goods. They became connectors. Ideas moved freely here. Religious debates happened in courtyards. Stories from China were told beside stories from the Mediterranean. Knowledge flowed naturally because people were curious. Daily life in Samarkand revolved around exchange. Mornings in markets, afternoons negotiating, storage, and onward transport. Evenings, eating together. Meals mattered. Sharing food built trust faster than contracts. Nearby, Butsera offered a different atmosphere. More disciplined, more scholarly, Butsera became known for learning as much as for trade. Many traders stayed longer here, studying languages, religious texts, or accounting methods. Education mattered on the Silk Road. A trader who could read numbers accurately, calculate profits, and understand contracts had an advantage. Knowledge reduced risk. Between these cities lay long stretches of nothing. This is where caravanserais saved lives. Caravanserais were built with intention. Thick walls protected against bandits. Courtyards allowed animals to rest safely. Wells ensured water. Some caravanserais included workshops, prayer rooms, and small markets. They were neutral spaces. No matter your origin, religion, or language, you were welcome if you followed the rules. Violence inside was forbidden. Theft was punished severely. These rules were enforced by reputation. A caravanserai that failed to protect guests would be abandoned. Inside, daily life followed a shared pattern. Animals unloaded first. Then humans ate. Then goods were checked. Stories were exchanged. News traveled fast here. Which route was blocked? Which ruler demanded higher taxes? Which city was dangerous? This information saved lives. Sleeping arrangements were simple. Mats, blankets, no privacy. Noise was constant. Coughing, snoring, animals shifting. But exhaustion made sleep possible, anywhere. Caravan life changed people. Time stretched, days blended. Traders learned patience. They learned to accept discomfort. Many became deeply religious, turning inward during long silent walks. Others became storytellers, using words to fight boredom. Then came Merv. Merv sat near rivers and fertiland, making it feel safer. It was a place to reorganize. Traders adjusted to new laws, new currencies, new customs. Persian influence was strong here. Administration mattered. Documents became more important. Taxes were more structured. Trade felt more official. Beyond Merv, routes led toward Mesopotamia and the heart of the Islamic world. Eventually, caravans reached Baghdad. Baghdad was overwhelming. Huge, busy, intellectual. Merchants arriving here felt they had reached the center of something important. Goods were unloaded into massive markets. Prices peaked. Profits were realized. Baghdad offered something rare. Stability. Under strong rule, trade flourished. Merchants could store goods, invest in new ventures, or partner with others. Some never returned east. They settled, married, and built new lives. Life for traders was not only about movement, it was about survival psychology. Loneliness was common. Fear was constant. Hope was necessary. Traders learned to live with uncertainty. They accepted loss as part of the journey. Animals died. Goods were stolen. Partners betrayed trust. Yet people kept traveling. Why? Because the Silk Road offered something no local market could. Possibility. Possibility of wealth, of knowledge, of a life beyond birthplace. Caravan life created a shared identity. Traders recognized each other by posture, by scars, by habits. They belonged everywhere and nowhere. They were citizens of the road. Cities like Chang'an, Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Baghdad were not just dots on a map. They were anchors in a moving world. They allowed humans to cross impossible distances. Without them, the Silk Road would have collapsed. Without caravans, cities would have faded. Together, they formed a system stronger than any empire. In the next chapter, we will see what truly transformed the world through these cities and caravans. Not silk alone, but ideas that reshaped belief, science, and power across continents. When people hear the words Silk Road, their minds almost always picture one thing first: silt, soft, shining fabric moving from China to the West. And while silk did give the network its name, it was never the whole story. In fact, if silk had been the only thing traded, the Silk Road would never have survived for centuries. The true power of the Silk Road lay in variety. It was a system built on many goods, many needs, and many desires. What one region lacked, another produced. What one culture valued deeply, another saw as ordinary. The Silk Road turned these differences into opportunity. This chapter is about everything that traveled alongside silk. Goods that fed people, armed armies, shaped art, fueled economies, and quietly tied distant worlds together. To understand this, imagine standing in a Silk Road market. You hear dozens of languages, you smell unfamiliar spices, you see objects you cannot name, made from materials you have never touched. Every item on display represents a journey, sometimes thousands of miles long. Let us begin with the goods that could change a meal, a medicine cabinet, or even a religion. Spices were among the most valuable commodities on the Silk Road, not because they were rare everywhere, but because they were rare in the places that wanted them most. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, ginger. These came mainly from India and Southeast Asia. Spices. In ancient and medieval times, spices were not just about flavor. They were used to preserve food, create medicines, perform religious rituals, and display wealth. A household with spices was a household with status. Because spices were lightweight and extremely valuable, they were perfect for long-distance trade. A small pouch could be worth a fortune in distant markets. This made spices a constant presence on Silk Road routes, both land and sea. Next to spices came tea. Tea began as a Chinese cultural product. At first, it was used for medicinal purposes. Over time, it became part of daily life. Tea bricks were easy to transport and even used as currency in some regions. As tea spread westward and northward, it reshaped habits, it created social rituals, and encouraged trade with nomadic groups who valued it highly. Tea was exchanged for horses, furs, and protection. What began as a local drink became a global habit. Then there was paper. Paper might be the most world-changing product ever carried on the Silk Road. Invented in China, paper slowly moved westward through trade, war, and cultural exchange. Before paper, writing materials were expensive and limited. Papyrus, parchment, silk, all costly. Paper changed that. It made record-keeping easier, contracts more common, books more affordable, knowledge more portable. As paper reached Central Asia, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe, it transformed administration, science, religion, and education. Paper did not just carry words, it carried power. Alongside paper traveled porcelain. Chinese porcelain was admired for its beauty and durability. Thin, white, and often decorated with blue designs. It was unlike pottery produced elsewhere. Porcelain became a symbol of refinement. Foreign elites prized it. Kings collected it. Merchants risked long journeys to acquire it. Like silk, porcelain was high value and relatively easy to transport. Its influence spread too. Other regions tried to imitate it, leading to new industries and technologies. Now let us turn to wealth itself. Gold and silver flowed in the opposite direction of many Chinese goods. While China exported silk, porcelain, and tea, it often imported precious metals. These metals were used for currency, decoration, and storage of wealth. Roman gold moved east. Persian silver circulated widely. Coins from distant empires have been found thousands of miles from where they were minted. Money itself became international. This flow of precious metals reveals something important. Trade was not one-sided. The Silk Road did not drain wealth from one region to enrich another forever. Instead, it created cycles of exchange. Regions specialized. Economies adjusted. One of the most important imports into China was horses. Central Asian horses were stronger and faster than Chinese breeds. They were essential for military power. The Han Dynasty actively traded silk for horses, knowing that control of borders depended on cavalry. Horses were not luxury items. They were strategic assets. This made nomadic groups key players in Silk Road trade. They controlled grazing lands and breeding expertise. They understood the terrain. They could protect caravans or destroy them. Trade gave them leverage. Then there was glass. Glassmaking was highly advanced in the Roman and Middle Eastern worlds. Glass vessels, beads, and decorative items traveled eastward. In China, glass was admired but difficult to produce at the same level initially. Glass objects became status symbols. They also influenced local craft traditions, leading to new styles and techniques. Textiles beyond silk also mattered. Wool from Central Asia, cotton from India, linen from the Mediterranean. These fabrics met different needs. Wool for cold climates, cotton for heat. Textile trade connected climate to commerce. Clothing styles changed as fabrics moved. Fashion followed trade routes. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. Why did all this work? Because supply and demand were not local? They were global, even if people did not use that word. A farmer in India did not know the name of a city in China. A silk weaver in China did not know who wore the fabric in Rome, yet their lives were connected through price, availability, and desire. If species became scarce in one region, prices rose elsewhere. If silk production increased, markets adjusted. Trade routes shifted based on demand. This created economic interdependence. Regions began to rely on goods they did not produce. This reliance encouraged peace at times and conflict at others. Protecting trade became a priority for empires. The Silk Road also spread technology alongside goods. Techniques for metalworking, weaving, navigation, and medicine traveled quietly. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. A craftsman moved. A slave was captured. A marriage occurred. Knowledge followed people. Even food crops moved along these routes. Grapes, pomegranates, walnuts, carrots, and citrus fruits spread across regions. Diets changed. Agriculture adapted. The Silk Road reshaped what people ate, but not all goods brought benefit. Diseases also traveled. Plagues followed trade routes, carried by people, animals, and goods. The same connections that allowed prosperity also allowed catastrophe. This is the cost of connection. Yet people did not stop trading, because the rewards outweighed the risks. The Silk Road was not a single economy. It was many economies linked together. Each region produced what it could best make. Each region desired what it lacked. This specialization increased efficiency. It also increased vulnerability. When routes were blocked by war, economies suffered. When new routes opened, cities rose. Trade shaped politics. Goods shaped history. Silk may have named the road, but spices fueled it. Paper transformed it. Horses defended it. Gold financed it. Porcelain decorated it. Porcelain decorated it. Glass dazzled it. Textiles clothed it. Together, these goods formed a system where distant lives affected each other in invisible ways. A decision made in a Chinese workshop could influence a Roman dinner table. A harvest in India could change prices in Baghdad. A horse bred in the steppes could alter the balance of power in China. This is what made the Silk Road revolutionary. Not movement, connection. In the next chapter, we will follow something even more powerful than goods along these routes. Ideas, religions, beliefs that crossed deserts and oceans and reshaped how people understood the world itself. If goods were the visible cargo of the Silk Road, then ideas were its invisible force. Silk could be folded, weighed, and sold. Spices could be smelled and tasted. But ideas traveled differently. They moved quietly, carried in conversations, prayers, songs, stories, and habits. They passed from teacher to student, from traveler to host, from parent to child. And once they took root, they changed societies far more deeply than any luxury good ever could. This chapter is the heart of the Silk Road story, because the Silk Road did not just connect markets, it connected minds. To understand this exchange, imagine a caravan stopping at an oasis city at dusk. The animals are unloaded, a fire is lit. Merchants from different lands sit together, sharing food. Someone asks a question, someone tells a story, someone explains a belief. No one is trying to convert anyone. They are simply talking. This is how ideas move. Let us begin with a belief system that traveled farther along the Silk Road than almost any other: Buddhism. Buddhism was born in India, but it did not remain there. Long before large-scale trade routes existed, Buddhist monks traveled on foot, spreading teachings through oral tradition. When the Silk Road began to form, it gave Buddhism something powerful: infrastructure. Monks traveled with caravans. They stayed in the same cities. They used the same routes. Trade cities became centers of learning and worship. As Buddhism moved north and east through Central Asia, it adapted. In places like Gondada, Buddhist art blended Indian spiritual themes with Greek artistic styles. Statues of the Buddha began to resemble Greek gods, with flowing robes and realistic human features. By the time Buddhism reached China, it had already changed. Chinese scholars struggled at first to understand Buddhist ideas. Concepts like reincarnation and enlightenment were unfamiliar. Translation was difficult. Many early translations used Taoist terms to explain Buddhist philosophy. Slowly, Chinese Buddhism emerged as something new. Schools formed. Monasteries were built along trade routes. These monasteries served multiple roles: religious centers, hostels for travelers, libraries, safe havens. Buddhism did not spread through force. It spread through presence. Through monks who lived simply. Through art that inspired curiosity. Through texts copied on paper that traveled easily. Paper mattered here. Without paper, Buddhism would not have spread as effectively. Writing sacred texts on silk or parchment was expensive. Your paper made, copying, affordable. Knowledge multiplied. Now, let us turn westward. Christianity also traveled along the Silk Road, though in a quieter way. Early Christian communities appeared in Central Asia and Persia, centuries before Christianity became dominant in Europe. One branch, known today as Nestorian Christianity, spread eastward along trade routes. Churches were established in cities like Merv and Samarkand. Christian symbols have been found carved into stones and crosses discovered far from Europe. Christian merchants carried their faith with them. They did not build empires. They built communities. For many traders, religion provided comfort on dangerous journeys. Prayer offered meaning when life felt uncertain. Faith created bonds between strangers. Then came Islam. Islam emerged in the 7th century and spread rapidly across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. When Islamic rule reached key Silk Road regions, trade did not decline. It expanded. Islam encouraged trade. Merchants were respected. Contracts were formalized. Ethical rules governed business behavior. Trust increased. Muslim traders connected the Silk Road to maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. This linked China, Southeast Asia, India, Africa, and the Mediterranean into one vast trading world. Islamic cities like Baghdad became centers of learning. Scholars gathered knowledge from Greek, Indian, Persian, and Chinese sources. Texts were translated. Ideas compared. This was not a one-way flow. Chinese knowledge entered the Islamic world. Islamic science influenced China. Both benefited. Religion on the Silk Road did not replace culture. It blended with it. Now step back and look beyond religion. Consider language. The Silk Road was one of the most multilingual environments in history. Traders often spoke several languages poorly, rather than one perfectly. This created simplified trade languages, shared terms, and gestures. Over time, languages borrowed from each other. Words for goods, measurements, and money crossed borders. Scripts influenced writing systems. Translation became a profession. Language exchange shaped thought itself. Now consider art. Art along the Silk Road was never pure. It was hybrid. Motifs moved across regions. Patterns repeated in different forms. Chinese silk designs appeared in Persian textiles. Persian metalwork influenced Chinese decoration. Buddhist cave paintings combined Indian themes, Central Asian styles, and Chinese techniques. Art became evidence of contact. It showed where ideas had traveled, even when written records were lost. Now consider science and technology. The Silk Road acted as a highway for innovation. Papermaking moved westward from China. Once Islamic scholars learned papermaking techniques, book production increased dramatically. Libraries expanded. Education spread. Eventually, paper reached Europe, transforming everything from bureaucracy to literature. Medicine traveled too. Chinese herbal knowledge mixed with Indian Ayurvedic practices and Greek medical theory preserved by Islamic scholars. Doctors learned from each other. Treatments improved. Medical texts were shared. Astronomy benefited from exchange. Star charts, instruments, and calculations moved across regions. Navigation improved. Calendars became more accurate. Even everyday technologies spread. Stirrups, which revolutionized cavalry warfare, moved westward. New farming tools improved agriculture. Textile techniques evolved. None of this required conquest. It required contact. But exchange was not always peaceful. Ideas challenged traditions. Religions competed. Authorities feared foreign beliefs. Some rulers restricted movement. Others encouraged it. Still, ideas found ways to travel. A monk disguised as a trader. A book hidden in cargo. A conversation overheard. The Silk Road rewarded curiosity. It punished isolation. One of the most important cultural exchanges was the concept of knowledge itself. In many Silk Road societies, learning became valued. Scholars were respected. Libraries were protected. Translation was celebrated. This attitude shaped civilizations. The Islamic Golden Age. Chinese scholarly traditions. European Renaissance influences. All were connected, directly or indirectly, through Silk Road exchanges. Even music traveled. Instruments moved. Scales changed. Rhythms blended. Court music in China incorporated Central Asian styles. Persian music absorbed influences from India. Sound crossed borders. So did food culture. Ingredients spread. Cooking methods adapted. Noodles moved west. Dumplings changed shape. Bread styles evolved. Everyday life was transformed quietly. But perhaps the most important exchange was perspective. People learned that the world was larger than their village, that other cultures had their own wisdom. That difference did not always mean danger. This did not create peace everywhere, but it created awareness. Awareness is powerful. The Silk Road made it impossible to pretend the world was small. It taught civilizations that isolation was temporary, that ideas would arrive whether welcomed or not. In this way, the Silk Road prepared humanity for a connected future. Goods connected economies. Ideas connected souls. Religion offered meaning. Science offered progress. Art offered expression. Language offered understanding. All of this moved along the same dusty paths, through the same caravanserais, across the same deserts and mountains. The Silk Road was not just a trade network. It was a conversation that lasted centuries. And its echoes are still with us today. In the next chapter, we will see how this powerful network faced its greatest challenges. Empires rising and falling. Wars, plagues, and political shifts that tested whether the Silk Road could survive the very connections it created. The Silk Road did not exist in a vacuum. It was not a free highway anyone could travel without consequence. For trade to flourish over thousands of miles, empires were necessary sometimes as protectors, sometimes as exploiters, sometimes as both. The Silk Road was shaped as much by politics as by geography, and understanding the empires that controlled it helps us see why it lasted so long. This chapter is about power, protection, taxation, and strategy. It is about how rulers understood the value of connection, and how those connections enriched empires, merchants, and ordinary people alike. Imagine the Silk Road as a fragile thread stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Without empires, this thread could easily be snapped. Deserts could claim travelers, bandits could intercept caravans. Without governance, trade might have been impossible, or at least far less profitable. The first major empire to influence the Silk Road in its early days was Han China. The Han Dynasty, which began in 26 BCE, inherited the vast Chinese state and understood the economic and strategic value of trade. The Han court did not seek to create the Silk Road as a commercial highway from the outset. It emerged from necessity. The Han Empire faced constant threats along its western borders, particularly from the nomadic Xiongnu. These were skilled horsemen who could strike quickly and vanish across the steppe. To protect its borders and encourage stability, the Han expanded westward, establishing outposts, forts, and garrisons along what became the Hexi Corridor. These military installations were more than defensive structures. They became the backbone of trade protection. Caravans traveling westward could rely on these waypoints for guidance, supplies, and protection. Han China also used trade strategically. Silk, one of its most prized commodities, was often exchanged for horses and other goods needed to secure borders. The emperor understood that trade was a form of diplomacy. By regulating who could trade, controlling production of silk, and monitoring caravans, Han China ensured that commerce served both economic and political goals. West of China, Parthia emerged as a major player. The Parthian Empire, controlling much of modern-day Iran from around 247 BCE to 224 CE, sat at the heart of Eurasia. It was a crossroads of civilizations. The Parthians understood that geography gave them power. Caravans, traveling from China toward the Mediterranean, had to pass through their territory. This allowed them to collect taxes, impose tariffs, and provide protection for a fee. Parthians were not merely intermediaries. They were enforcers of stability. Their control over the Iranian plateau meant that merchants could traverse deserts and mountains, knowing that armed forces could respond to threats. Yet, Parthians were also flexible. They allowed local rulers considerable autonomy, and they encouraged trade because economic growth strengthened the state. Further east, the Kushan Empire played a critical role during the early centuries CE. The Kushans controlled a vast territory encompassing parts of modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Their empire connected Indian markets to Central Asia. This made them pivotal intermediaries in the Silk Road network. Kushan rulers were particularly notable for their promotion of Buddhism along trade routes. Monasteries and stupas along the Silk Road not only served spiritual needs, but also functioned as resting points for travelers. These religious institutions often provided shelter, food, and medical care. In doing so, Kushan-controlled regions became safer and more attractive for merchants, which encouraged more trade. The Kushans also minted coins recognized throughout Central Asia and beyond. facilitating commerce across vast distances. Their economy was deeply interconnected with Silk Road traffic, and their political stability allowed trade to flourish. Meanwhile, across the western end of the Silk Road, the Roman Empire was the ultimate consumer of luxury goods from the East. Roman elites had an insatiable appetite for silk. They wanted Chinese silk, Indian spices, gemstones, and exotic animals. Rome never controlled the overland routes directly, but it exerted influence through diplomacy and alliances with Parthians and other intermediaries. The Romans understood that the Silk Road could drain wealth if trade was unregulated. Gold and silver flowed eastward to purchase silk, pepper, and other luxury items. Roman authorities attempted to control this outflow of precious metals, but the demand was insatiable. The Roman example demonstrates a critical point. Empires were not only protecting trade, they were also consuming it. Political stability in regions along the Silk Road allowed demand in one empire to stimulate supply across many others. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, trade did not disappear. Instead, new powers emerged. The Abbasid Caliphate, beginning in the mid-8th century CE, became a dominant force in the Middle East and Central Asia. The Abbasids understood trade as a tool for building. Their capital, Baghdad, became a center of both commerce and learning. Merchants were welcomed. Caravan routes were secured. Taxes were collected efficiently. Rules protected property and contracts. Under the Abbasids, the Silk Road reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. Paper, originally from China, facilitated record-keeping and administration. Banking practices and letters of credit allowed merchants to travel with less risk. The Caliphate's intellectual culture encouraged the flow of knowledge as well as goods, further linking commerce to the spread of science, mathematics, and medicine. In Abbasid territories, political stability was directly tied to economic growth. Where governors maintained security along caravan routes, cities thrived. Where unrest occurred, trade shifted to safer paths, sometimes thousands of miles away. The empire's influence shaped the decisions of individual merchants in subtle but powerful ways. Perhaps the most dramatic transformation of the Silk Road occurred under the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Mongols, under leaders like Genghis Khan and later Kublai Khan, unite a vast stretch of Eurasia, from China to Eastern Europe. For the first time, much of the Silk Road was under a single political authority. The Mongols understood that commerce strengthened their empire. They implemented systems of passports and protection, known as paisa, which allowed merchants to travel freely and safely. Caravans could cross vast distances with less fear of robbery. Cities along the Silk Road flourished under this security. The Pax Mongolico, the Mongol peace, was transformative. Trade accelerated. Ideas flowed more freely. Technologies such as papermaking, printing, gunpowder, and astronomy spread more efficiently than ever before. The Mongols were not just conquerors. They were facilitators of connection. Across all these empires, a pattern emerges. Political stability created prosperity. Where rulers protected trade routes, merchants thrived. Where empires taxed fairly and enforced contracts, cities grew. Where borders were porous and conflicts frequent, trade slowed. It is important to note that control of the Silk Road was rarely absolute. No empire could govern every oasis, desert pass, or mountain route. Instead, control was often exercised over key choke points, trade hubs, and critical stretches of territory. Empires provided three main services that made trade viable. Protection, soldiers, fortifications, and legal systems reduced the risk of banditry. Merchants could travel with a level of security that made long-distance trade feasible. Regulation, tariffs, customs duties, and standardized weights and measures allowed trade to operate smoothly. Without this, trust would have been impossible. Infrastructure, roads, caravanserais, bridges, and way stations facilitated movement of goods and people. Without infrastructure, deserts and mountains would have made trade nearly impossible. Through these measures, empires transformed perilous journeys into structured commerce. They made the Silk Road not just a network of paths, but a functioning economic system. Empires also dictated cultural influence. Merchants were exposed to legal systems, languages, and social norms that influenced behavior and decision-making across the network. In this way, political control shaped not only trade, but the very culture of commerce. In short, the Silk Road could only flourish where power, governance, and trade interests align. Each empire, from Han China to the Mongols, understood this dynamic. Protect the routes, manage commerce, and wealth flows. Fail, and trade vanishes. By the time the Mongols created a near-continuous political span across Eurasia, the Silk Road had reached its peak. Luxury goods, ideas, religions, and technology flowed across continents with unprecedented speed and safety. Political stability amplified the value of what had always been fragile: human trust. The lesson of these empires is clear. Without political authority ensuring safety and reliability, the Silk Road could not have endured for centuries. Its longevity was not just the product of geography or human ingenuity, but of governance, strategy, and the recognition that commerce and statecraft are inseparable. In the next chapter, we will examine how this extraordinary system eventually faced disruption. Plagues, warfare, shifting empires, and maritime alternatives challenged the Silk Road's dominance. Yet even in decline, its legacy endured, shaping the modern world in ways few could have imagined. The 13th and 14th centuries marked a period unlike any the Silk Road had ever seen before. For centuries, merchants had braved deserts, mountains, and shifting empires, relying on fragmented protection, local alliances, and their own experience. But the Mongol Empire changed everything. It transformed a network of dangerous trade paths into a continent-spanning system of commerce, culture, and connection. This period is often called the Golden Age of Silk Road trade. And understanding why requires looking at both the Mongol state and the people who traveled its roads. Imagine a map of Eurasia around 1300 CE. From the shores of China to the edge of Europe, vast territories lay under the authority of one ruling dynasty, the Mongols. This empire was unprecedented in its size and scope. It spanned the deserts of Central Asia, the steppes of Mongolia, the mountains of Persia, and the forests of Eastern Europe. For the first time in centuries, much of the Silk Road existed under a single political system. The Mongols were initially feared as warriors. Their reputation for speed, discipline, and ruthlessness spread far ahead of their armies. But once conquered territories were pacified, the Mongols became exceptional administrators. They understood that commerce increased wealth, which in turn strengthened political control. Security and safety. Under Mongol rule, caravan routes that had once been perilous became surprisingly safe. The Mongols implemented measures to protect travelers and enforce law across their empire. Patrols guarded key passes and oases. Banditry was punished severely. Merchants could travel thousands of miles with far less fear than in previous centuries. A system of paisa, or passports, was introduced. Merchants carrying these official tablets could demand food, shelter, and protection along the road. Caravan leaders could travel quickly, secure in the knowledge that local officials would honor the Mongol decree. The impact of this security cannot be overstated. Before the Mongols, traders relied heavily on luck, local alliances, or their own skill to survive the journey. With Mongol protection, trade accelerated. Caravans moved faster. Merchants carried larger loads. The volume of goods, silk, spices, porcelain, paper, metals expanded dramatically. Infrastructure and administration. The Mongols did more than simply protect roads. They built infrastructure to make trade efficient. Bridges were repaired, way stations maintained, and relay posts set up to speed communication. This network allowed goods, messages, and people to move with a reliability previously unimaginable. Alongside physical infrastructure, the Mongols encouraged administrative efficiency. They standardized taxes and tolls along routes, reducing arbitrary charges and corruption. This predictability allowed merchants to plan long journeys with more confidence. Mongol policies also encouraged international merchants to travel freely. Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Chinese all operated under a legal system that respected contracts and protected property. Trade became safer for both East and West. East-West connection, at its peak. During this period, connections between East and West reached unprecedented levels. Goods moved faster and in greater variety. Luxury items such as silk and porcelain left China, traveling to the Middle East, Persia, and Europe. In return, glassware, spices, precious metals, and horses moved eastward. Ideas and technologies flowed along with goods. Paper-making techniques, printing methods, and medicinal knowledge from China spread west. Mathematics, astronomy, and scientific methods from the Islamic world moved east. Languages and writing systems mingled in trade cities. Cultural exchange was accelerated by the security and openness provided by Mongol rule. Famous travelers, Marco Polo and beyond. One of the most famous examples of East-West interaction during the Mongol era is Marco Polo, the Venetian trader and traveler. Born in 1254, Marco Polo left Venice in 1271 with his father and uncle. Traveling east through Central Asia, his journey lasted over 2 decades, taking him across deserts, mountains, and numerous cities under Mongol administration. In the Mongol world, Polo had unprecedented access. He traveled under the protection of the Mongols, sometimes acting as a diplomat or messenger for Kublai Khan. He visited cities that were hubs of Silk Road commerce. including Beijing, then known as Khanbali, and observed the Mongol administration, trade practices, and culture. Marco Polo's accounts, though often exaggerated or romanticized, provided Europe with some of its first detailed knowledge of China, Central Asia, and the Silk Road. His writings inspired curiosity, commerce, and exploration for centuries to come. Other travelers also flourished. Chinese envoys visited Persia. Muslim merchants traded in Beijing. Buddhist monks traveled across Asia, translating texts and teaching. The Mongol Empire's openness created a network that was not limited by ethnicity, religion, or geography. Trade cities flourish. Under Mongol protection, Silk Road cities reached new heights. Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Baghdad, and Beijing all saw increased activity. Caravanserais were bustling with merchants and travelers. Markets overflowed with goods from multiple continents. Cities became centers of learning, culture, and diplomacy. Samarkand, for example, flourished under the Timurid dynasty, which came shortly after Mongol influence but benefited from Mongol infrastructure. It became a hub for artisans, scholars, and traders from China, Persia, India, and Europe. Markets featured silks, ceramics, spices, paper, and precious stones. Scholars and merchants exchanged not only goods but ideas, from mathematics to medicine. Baghdad, once a center of the Abbasid Caliphate, recovered some prominence during Mongol rule as merchants and scholars traveled safely through the region. Even cities that were far from the empire, as political centers, benefited from the security and stability the Mongols imposed. Daily life on the Mongol-era Silk Road. For traders and travelers, life was still challenging, but conditions improved. Caravanserais provided shelter, food, and water. Camels, horses, and donkeys were cared for by experienced handlers. Guides who knew the terrain, oases, and local laws were indispensable. Caravans traveled in stages, often covering 15 to 25 miles per day, depending on terrain. Oases provided respite, but traders had to be alert for sudden sandstorms, flash floods, or political changes. Despite the dangers, Mongol administration reduced the number of unpredictable hazards. Cultural exchange was woven into daily life. Traders encountered foods, clothing, languages, and religious practices from multiple regions. Children learned multiple tongues. Merchants exchanged knowledge about markets and pricing. Medical practices and remedies moved from one region to another. Even art and music spread along caravan routes. The impact of Mongol rule. The Mongol era demonstrates how political stability can amplify the economic and cultural potential of trade networks. By providing protection, infrastructure, and legal consistency, the Mongols created an environment in which commerce could flourish across unprecedented distances. This period also highlights the limits and vulnerabilities of trade. The Mongol Empire was vast, but it depended on strong central leadership. After the death of key leaders, regional instability sometimes arose. Caravans could still face banditry, natural disasters, or political upheaval. Yet, compared to previous centuries, the Golden Age of Mongol-era trade represented a peak in Silk Road connectivity. The legacy of the Golden Age. The Mongol era left a lasting legacy. It connected East and West more completely than ever before. It facilitated the spread of goods, ideas, and technologies. It created new opportunities for exploration, diplomacy, and cultural synthesis. Marco Polo's journey, and the journeys of countless lesser-known merchants, scholars, and envoys, exemplify the profound human dimension of this era. People were not merely moving goods, they were bridging civilizations. They carried stories, beliefs, and knowledge as eagerly as silk and spices. The Golden Age of trade under the Mongols stands as a testament to what is possible when success, governance, and human curiosity converge. It shows that commerce is not just an economic activity, it is a force for cultural connection and exchange. In the next chapter, we will explore how the Silk Road began to change after this Golden Age. As political fragmentation, maritime trade, and shifting powers challenged the overland routes. Even as overland dominance waned, the legacy of the Mongol era continued to influence global connections for centuries to come. The Silk Road endured for over 1,000 years, shaping civilizations, economies, and cultures across Eurasia. Yet even the most robust networks faced change. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the Silk Road began to decline. This decline was not sudden, but the result of multiple overlapping forces, shifting political powers, emerging maritime trade, natural disasters, and disease. Understanding these factors explains why an extraordinary era of overland trade eventually gave way to new forms of global connectivity. The rise of maritime trade. One of the most significant factors in the decline of the Silk Road was the expansion of sea routes. Maritime technology advanced significantly between the 13th and 15th centuries. Improved shipbuilding, navigational tools, and knowledge of wind patterns made long-distance sea voyages safer, faster, and more reliable than overland journeys. Previously, most goods traveled thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and politically fragmented territories. Caravans moved slowly, averaging 15 to 25 miles a day. Merchants faced banditry, harsh weather, scarcity of water, and bureaucratic obstacles from multiple empires. Even in the Mongol Golden Age, when security was at its peak, long distances made trade risky. Sea routes offered an alternative. Ships could carry much larger cargoes, including bulk goods that were impracticable for camels and horses. Spices, ceramics, and even silk could be transported faster and at lower cost. Over time, merchants began to prefer maritime trade. Gradually diverting commerce away from the Silk Road, European powers played a critical role in this shift. Portugal, Spain, and later the Dutch and British invested heavily in maritime exploration. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 opened direct sea access to Asian markets. This diminished the importance of overland trade routes that had been central for centuries. Political instability and the fragmentation of empires. The Silk Road relied on political stability. Political instability and the fragmentation of empires. The Silk Road relied on political stability. During the Mongol era, trade thrived precisely because a single authority controlled vast stretches of territory. But after the death of Kublai Khan and the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, political stability crumbled. Central Asia, whence a corridor of peace under Mongol rule, became fragmented into competing khanates. Local rulers, often hostile to one another, levied heavy taxes or outright restricted caravan movement. Banditry increased, and merchants faced new risks. Deserts, mountains, and hostile territories became even more dangerous. Similarly, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East had long provided relative stability for trade. Its decline in the 13th and 14th centuries, exacerbated by invasions and internal strife, disrupted trade networks. Cities that had flourished for centuries, like Baghdad and Merv, suffered decline. Caravans could no longer rely on a predictable political environment. In China, the fall of the Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty also contributed to shifting trade patterns. Ming rulers initially supported overland trade but gradually focused on maritime expansion. The famous treasure fleets of Zheng He, launched in the early 15th century, symbolized a pivot toward sea-based commerce rather than overland routes. The impact of disease. The Black Death. The impact of disease. The Black Death. Disease played a major role in the decline of Silk Road commerce. The Black Death, which swept across Eurasia in the mid-14th century, devastated populations and disrupted trade. The plague is believed to have originated in Central Asia, possibly along trade routes, and spread westward through caravan networks. Cities that had been thriving trade hubs lost significant portions of their population. Merchants, artisans, and laborers died in unprecedented numbers. Markets emptied. Production declined. The human infrastructure that had supported Silk Road trade caravan operators, animal handlers, warehouse managers, and local officials was decimated. The psychological impact of disease was also significant. Merchants became more cautious, travel slowed, and some abandoned routes entirely. Communities along the Silk Road, once cosmopolitan and connected, retreated inward. This withdrawal further reduced the volume of trade. Economic shifts and changing demand. As sea routes gained prominence and empires fragmented, the economics of overland trade shifted. Transporting goods across thousands of miles of desert and mountain became increasingly expensive compared to maritime shipping. Silk, spices, porcelain, and other luxury goods could now be shipped faster, safer, and in larger quantities by sea. In addition, European demand shifted. With direct access to Asian markets via the Indian Ocean and the Cape of Good Hope, European merchants could bypass intermediary cities and khanates entirely. Profits from overland trade decreased. Silk Road merchants, who had relied on relaying goods from one region to another, found their roles diminished. Local economies along the Silk Road suffered as well. Cities that had depended on passing caravans lost revenue from tolls, taxes, and commerce. Some settlements were abandoned entirely. Others adapted to regional trade, but nothing replaced the scale and vibrancy of earlier Silk Road commerce. Environmental and logistical challenges. Even before political instability and disease, the Silk Road was always a fragile system. Caravans depended on scarce water sources, seasonal timing, and careful planning. Deserts like the Taklamakan and mountains like the Pamirs remained as formidable as ever. Any disruption, whether from war, climate, or local unrest, could halt trade. During the 14th and 15th centuries, climate variability may have further complicated travel. Droughts, reduced water availability at key oases, harsh winters made mountain passes impassable. Over time, these natural challenges combined with human instability to make overland trade less reliable. Cultural consequences of the decline. The decline of the Silk Road had cultural implications as well, combined with human instability to make overland trade less reliable. Cultural consequences of the decline. The decline of the Silk Road had cultural implications as well. With fewer merchants and travelers moving across continents, the exchange of ideas, art, religion, and technology slowed. Buddhism, which had spread along the Silk Road from India to China centuries earlier, saw reduced influence in Central Asia. Trade and scientific knowledge, mathematics, and medicine became more localized. However, the legacy of the Silk Road persisted. Cultural blending, hybrid art forms, and linguistic exchanges remained in the cities and regions that had once thrived along the route. Knowledge that had been carried across Eurasia influenced later societies, even as the volume of trade diminished. The transition to maritime dominance. By the 15th century, maritime trade had largely supplanted overland routes as the dominant form of global commerce. European powers established direct connections with China, India, and Southeast Asia. Asian goods could reach European markets faster and in greater quantities than through caravans. This shift did not end Silk Road trade entirely, but it reduced its economic centrality. Overland commerce continued regionally, especially in Central Asia and between neighboring empires. Caravans still carried local goods, and some long-distance trade persisted. But the scale and intensity of the golden centuries of Silk Road trade had passed. Golden centuries of Silk Road trade had passed. Summary of decline factors. The decline of the Silk Road was multifaceted. 1. Maritime trade. Safer, faster, and more cost-effective sea routes diverted commerce from overland paths. 2. Political fragmentation. The fall of empires like the Mongols and Abbasids created instability, taxation, and banditry that discouraged trade. 3. Disease. The Black Death decimated populations and disrupted markets along the route. 4. Economic shifts. European direct access to Asian markets reduced the profitability of overland trade. 5. Environmental challenges. Deserts, mountains, and climate variability made overland routes increasingly risky. Together, these forces transformed Eurasian trade. The Silk Road did not disappear overnight. Its decline was gradual, punctuated by the rise of new trade networks and the shifting ambitions of empires and explorers. Legacy of the Silk Road. Even in decline, the Silk Road left a profound legacy. Cities, cultures, and civilizations that had grown along its paths retained the influence of centuries of exchange. Knowledge, art, religion, and language carried along the Silk Road continued to shape societies long after the caravans diminished. The lessons of the Silk Road endured. Connections between distant peoples create wealth, culture, and innovation. Trade is more than economics. It is human interaction, diplomacy, and the spread of ideas. Even as maritime routes replaced overland paths, the Silk Road's influence persisted in the minds, customs, and technologies of the world it had helped to knit together. In the next and final chapter, we will reflect on the enduring legacy of the Silk Road, how it shaped the modern world, influenced globalization, and left a heritage of human connection that continues to resonate today. The Silk Road may have declined centuries ago, but its legacy continues to shape the modern world. What began as a network of dusty caravan routes has left a permanent mark on trade, culture, diplomacy, and the ways civilizations interact. Its story is not just history, it's the foundation for globalization as we know it today. Cultural diversity. One of the most enduring legacies of the Silk Road is the cultural diversity it created. Cities along the route like Samarkand, Kashgar, Chang'an, and Baghdad became melting pots of language, religion, and customs. People from vastly different backgrounds lived, traded, and communicated side by side. Even today, many of these regions retain traces of that diversity. Art, architecture, cuisine, and language all bear the imprint of centuries of interaction. The Silk Road taught the world that cultures could coexist, blend, and influence one another. It showed that human connection enriches societies in ways beyond material wealth. Global trade. The Silk Road also laid the groundwork for global trade. By connecting distant economies, it created a model of interdependence. What one region produced could meet the needs of another, thousands of miles away. Modern international trade operates on a similar principle. Countries specialize in what they produce best and exchange goods and services with others. The Silk Road proved that long-distance trade is feasible, profitable, and transformative. Concepts like supply chains, tariffs, and trade networks, so central to today's economies, have their roots in the strategies and lessons of Silk Road commerce, diplomacy, and exchange of ideas. The Silk Road diplomacy and exchange of ideas. The Silk Road was never just about goods. Ideas, technology, and religion flowed along its routes. Buddhist texts moved from India to China. Paper-making knowledge traveled from China to the Islamic world. Mathematical and scientific ideas spread westward, and artistic influences merged across continents. Today, diplomacy and international collaboration echoed this tradition. Conferences, cultural exchanges, educational partnerships, and international trade agreements reflect the same principles. Understanding, trust, and communication are essential for connected societies. The Silk Road proved that shared knowledge and exchange strengthen civilizations as much as commerce. Modern echoes, the Belt and Road Initiative. In the 21st century, the idea of the Silk Road has inspired modern projects like China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. This vast infrastructure program aims to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through roads, railways, ports, and trade agreements. While modern technology and geopolitics differ from the ancient world, the underlying principle is the same. Connection fosters opportunity. Just as ancient Silk Road merchants relied on safe routes and cooperative cities, modern trade and infrastructure depend on diplomacy, logistics, and collaboration. The Silk Road idea remains a guiding symbol for building bridges literally and metaphorically between nations. The Silk Road idea remains a guiding symbol for building bridges literally and metaphorically between nations. The Silk Road teaches several lessons relevant today. Connection creates resilience. Societies linked by trade and culture thrive more than isolated ones. Diversity strengthens communities. Exposure to different ideas, religions, and art forms fosters innovation. Trade is more than commerce. Economic exchange carries knowledge, technology, and culture. Stability matters. Political and social stability encourage safe and prosperous interactions. These lessons are timeless. From global supply chains to cultural diplomacy, the Silk Road's legacy continues to inform how the world approaches trade and cooperation. The story of the Silk Road is not just about silk, spices, or caravans. It is about human curiosity, connection, and the relentless desire to explore, trade, and communicate. Its influence stretches from ancient cities to modern infrastructure projects, reminding us that the world has always been interconnected. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the Silk Road and want to explore more stories that connect the past with our modern world, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps bring more fascinating history to life, one chapter at a time.